share a little bit with you about what I do for a living. I am an architect. Now, what does an architect do? When you hear the word architect, someone needs an architect for this. I need to hire an architect. Well, an architect is related to designing buildings. Any building you see in the city, actually everywhere you go, there are buildings. You normally think of houses, retail stores, shopping malls, hospitals, libraries, banks, even a garage. Any kind of structure in the city, you need an architect. And being an architect, there's really two sides to being an architect. First of all, an architect is something that it's a practical thing. You need someone who knows how to put a building together. Now, the architect doesn't actually build the building himself with bricks and concrete and hammer and nails. The architect puts together the design, the layout of the building, and then with the drawings, the contractors or the construction people take care of the actual bricks and the concrete and everything. But the architect's, one of the major concerns, major jobs of the architect is to make sure that the buildings are safe, because people will be occupying them, living in them, using them, or even just passing through them or passing outside. And it is the architect's responsibility to make sure every structure that is built is safe. It meets the rules and regulations for safety from the city, from the building codes. There are laws that are in place to make sure that buildings are built to a certain standard so people are safe. So the life and the safety of the people is one of the major responsibilities of the architect. On the other side of being an architect is the more creative aspect. Architecture is also a form of art. It's something that there's really no, an art is something where there's no right answer, there's no definite answer. There's not only one way to put together a building. So it becomes, in a way, like art. So anytime you get a chance to design a building, the shape of the building, the way you do the finishes and the details, the colors, the materials, in a way, there's an element of fashion about architecture. You know, buildings come up in a certain generation, they tend to have a certain style because that was in that period, in the 70s. But then you notice that in the 80s or the 90s, a new style comes in and that style seems old. So there's this whole aspect of trends and fashions coming in and coming out. So being an architect it's important to kind of be in, know what's in, know what people like for that period. So to be aware of the trends, the aesthetic trends. But besides what the trends are, every architect, like every artist, has his or her own style. So how many of you know of Frank Gehry? He's the architect who does his buildings that are like crazy looking. Anybody familiar with the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles? It's a new building. Okay.
No.
Anybody familiar with this building that we're in right now? You know who the architect was for this building? It was me! I actually designed this building. So this was my first big project. And I don't know if you saw the front of the building. It's kind of a simple stucco finish with brick on the bottom. Simple thing with half round with windows. So that was kind of my first big project. But every architect has their own style. I would say my style right now is pretty simple because I'm still early and starting off. But people like Frank Gehry, how many of you are familiar with the Guggenheim Museum in Manhattan? You know the museum that you go in and then you start spiraling up and spiraling up. And there's no stairs. It's just one long spiraling ramp. That was one of the most famous buildings by an architect called Frank Lloyd Wright. He was probably the most famous American architect known to the people here. But architects are everywhere. People here are the famous ones, the most. But there are many, 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 many more non-famous architects than me. Normal people who just have a job to do, which is to make sure buildings are safe for people. make sure buildings are interesting, that they're not just boring boxes with holes for windows. It's important that, because a building is a permanent structure. It's going to be there for years. So it's important also to make it an interesting building, an interesting structure. Now, the last part I want to talk about is how I got into architecture. Now, when I was a kid, I first started picking up a crayon with my left hand, and I was doodling. And usually they say people who are left-handed are more creative, more artistic. That was me. And then my mom whacked me over the head and said, no, use your right hand, no left hand. Because I guess in Chinese tradition, you use your left hand and being bastard, you're being outside of convention. They have this whole thing about everyone must be right-handed. So I was kind of forced to use my right hand as well. But how that relates is pretty important, because architecture is not only about being an artist, because if it was, many more people would be doing it. Architecture also is about knowing math, knowing how things fit together. There's a very technical aspect about it. So being able to use your other side of your brain, the non-creative side, the more mathematical, linear, objective side of your brain, is also a very big part of being an architect. Not only do you have to be a little bit creative, but you also have to know how to do math and know how to do the more analytical aspects of design. So I think, personally, I think that's kind of what made it my destiny, because I was naturally left-handed, but I was forced to use my right hand. So naturally, I can actually use both hands. But to me, I feel like that means my creative part was developed, but also my analytical part, it was kind of forced, but nonetheless it was developed. So I think that's what made me an architect, being able to handle both the creative and the left and right hands, left and right brain part of work. So that's what an architect does, that's me, and now you know this building. Okay, thank you.